All right, class, welcome. Module 10 is on the civil rights era, civil rights movement. This is something that I'm pretty sure you have some prior knowledge on. So hopefully we can kind of broaden and deepen your prior knowledge with these events. Your book points out that the battle against racial injustice proceeded along two tracks, and this is very important for you to consider. At the grassroots and later, ultimately, the U.S. Congress. So it started with just normal everyday citizens, civilians, civil society groups, if you remember earlier examples of those in this course, organizing to solve a problem rather than waiting for the government to do something about it. And ultimately, as the book points out, the Congress, the government caught up and responded to this grassroots civil society movement. And this is an example of a thesis that some people have about certain events in American history that says politics is downstream of culture. Now, downstream in nature, if you think about a river, a stream, when you observe that moving water, that action, that's downstream of something else. And in this metaphor, there's an ice cap at the top of a mountain, the ice melts, and liquid water runs downstream. And then later on, downstream, you see the effect of that ice melting. And in this metaphor, the theory goes that politics, meaning what the government is doing basically, is downstream of culture. The political change happens, in other words, after the cultural change. That's what is meant by politics is downstream of culture. When you see the politics changing, it's a effect, it's the downstream effect of the fact that the culture changed first. So that is sometimes true, certainly not always, but something for you to consider. And if you can think of any other examples of this. Um, in the last unit, we talked very briefly about the homophile movement. All right. And in the gay rights movement in general, you could say, from a certain point of view, that this idea fits. Politics is downstream of culture. The cultural attitudes towards homosexuality changed first. And then later, the politicians caught up and reflected that change. And in the context of the civil rights movement, the culture changed first. And then later, according to this point of view, the government caught up and responded to the fact that the culture had already changed and the politicians needed to catch up with that reality. So just an interesting way of looking at our history for you to consider. There's one narrative that the politicians are in charge, and one narrative about the civil rights movement says the government was the hero, the politicians were the hero, they changed the society by passing the Civil Rights Act. Well, okay, maybe, or maybe the government and the politicians were not driving these events. Maybe it was people like Dr. King, Rosa Parks, you've heard of them. Maybe it was everyday average citizens organizing, making the change happen, and then the politicians caught up with that reality and jumped on board and said, "Oh yeah, 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 we've always been in favor of civil rights." All right, so it's just think about which of those two worldviews makes more sense to you. Are politicians driving the change, or are normal people driving the change, and then the politicians latch onto it after the fact? The Black middle class experienced robust growth after World War II and before the Civil Rights era. So there's about a 10-year gap between those two things. In other words, there was economic progress being made in the Black community even during the height of segregation, which is a remarkable thing to think about. And the book points out a really important point. Churches were especially important in the civil rights movement. Uh, Everyone's heard of Martin Luther King. What's his full title? Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He was a minister, Southern Baptist. Pretty sure you know that. The churches, and that's another example of civil society, right? That's not government, that's independent civil society groups, the churches were a major driver early on in the civil rights movement, especially in the South. Another major driver has to do with the technology that was available at the time, which was new at the time, the new medium of television. Whenever you are trying to change the world, whether that change is good, bad, or indifferent, you can see this throughout history. People that want to change the world and spread revolutionary ideas, if they're smart, they will understand how to use new media, new ways of spreading messages. If you're familiar with Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther, the German priest from 500 years ago that started what became known as the Protestant Reformation, major revolution within Christianity. What new medium was available to him at the time, 500 years ago? The printing press, the technology that first allowed people to mass produce written documents. That allowed Martin Luther to spread his revolutionary ideas. Skip ahead 500 years. What allowed Adolf Hitler to spread his ideas? What new medium? The radio. Jump ahead 20 years into the 1950s, early 60s. What helped the civil rights movement, and others, but in this context, what helped the civil rights movement spread their ideas? TV. That was a new medium, and it was used very effectively to spread the ideas of the civil rights movement. So this is a still image from TV footage from the mid 50s. You may have seen something about this in high school. This is one of the many, many, many times in the South. I believe this is from Little Rock, Arkansas, if I'm not mistaken, this image, but it happened repeatedly throughout the South, and not just the South, but when schools were integrated. And this young black girl, I believe she's 13, 14 years old, trying to enroll in eighth or ninth grade. And she's being surrounded by a, screaming, snarling mob of white people who are, you know, furious and trying to prevent her violently from entering the school. Now, things like this happens throughout our country in the context of civil rights. Black people being persecuted, assaulted, up until, up to and including murdered. That wasn't new. What was new was that people could see it because of this new medium of television. And we are visual people, most of us. If you read a newspaper article about a young black girl being harassed by a deranged mob, you might read that in the newspaper and say, man, that's unfortunate. Those people need to chill. But when you watch it on TV, it's going to hit you more viscerally, more emotionally. And this medium of television was incredibly effective during the civil rights era. It brought these issues to people's attention in a direct way that wasn't possible before. In our modern context, of course, the new medium, the new tool for disseminating information, whether that information is good or bad, is of course the internet. So all throughout history, we see these new media emerging: printing press, radio, TV, internet, and movements, revolutionary movements, whether you agree with them or not, will use the new media to spread their ideas. In terms of segregation, I know you all were taught about segregation in high school. I want to make sure you understand a really important distinction, that there were two types of segregation: de jure and de facto. De jure is Latin for by law. Now, usually in high school, what you learn about is this form of segregation. And you know this, in the South, mostly in the South, there was in your face, legalized, government mandated segregation. You've all learned about this. And you see in the image here, right? Segregated drinking fountains, segregated restaurants, segregated bathrooms, segregated movie theaters. You know this. What is very often left out of the narrative, though, especially in the Northeast with our textbooks, was very often left out of the narrative. Well, let me put it another way. The narrative usually goes, segregation was a problem, of course. but it was a problem in the South. The South had segregation and the North didn't. That's not true. It's very selective. It's very self-serving for the North and the Midwest and California to pretend like this was only a problem in Mississippi. Because the other type of segregation was called de facto segregation. Segregation by fact, not by law, didn't need to be written down, but as a practical reality in day-to-day life, the whole country was segregated, not just Alabama. Right? And think this through. In the Midwest, in Chicago, in LA, in New York, are there not, quote, black neighborhoods in every major American city? Yeah, there are. Are there not? And what's up with that? If there was no de jure segregation in Los Angeles, why is South Central Los Angeles shorthand for the black neighborhood? Why is the South Side of Chicago shorthand for the black neighborhood? Why was South Providence, where I grew up, the quote, black neighborhood? Why was Harlem in New York City the quote, black neighborhood? Because segregation existed all throughout the country. In the South, they put it right in your face and they wrote it down. In the North and in the Midwest, they kind of pretended it didn't exist, but it did exist. Okay? Let me give you one more anecdotal example of de facto segregation. The last public high school I taught at in Providence, Rhode Island, was about 10 years ago. Relatively small school, about 650 students. Out of those 650 students, and look, to be clear, I'm talking about 2016, okay? Not 1950, not 1970, not 2000, 2016, Providence, Rhode Island, teaching at a high school with 650 students. Out of the 650 students, 0 students were white. 0. Not 5, not like, oh, it was only 10% white. I mean, literally 0 white students. The only white people in that building were the teachers. Okay. Is that because there was a law de jure in Providence, Rhode Island in 2016 that, uh, you know, Dr. George Alvarez High School in Providence was only for Hispanics? No, that would be illegal. You know that. There's no such law. But if there's 650 kids in a school and 0 of them are white, is that not de jure segregation or de facto segregation rather? Is that not segregation by fact? So the whole country was segregated. In the South, they wrote it down and put it right in your face. In the North and the Midwest and the West Coast, they pretended it didn't exist, but in many ways, Los Angeles and Chicago and Boston were more segregated than Mississippi. The effects of segregation. So less education, and that then leads to all these other things. More poverty. There's a clear link there between those first two. Less ownership of homes. That obviously follows. Lower life expectancy. Now, segregation, as you know, legal segregation is dead and buried and has been for a very long time. Unfortunately, tragically, these disparities that you see here are still with us to a very large degree. Okay, these things are hard to undo. And again, we can trace this disparity all the way back to something we covered earlier, which is the failure to pay reparations at the end of the Civil War. The role of World War II on civil rights. So the World War II era is when the civil rights movement started to slowly kind of percolate. And in the minds of a lot of Americans, our narrative of World War II kind of forced this issue. Our narrative of World War II is that we were fighting for democracy and we were fighting against the Nazis who were insanely racist, right? And so do you see the problem in terms of our narrative? If racism is evil, How can we say that with a straight face? The Nazis were evil because they were racist. Fact check, true. But then turn around in our own country and treat millions of our own people like inferior. That doesn't work, right? And the fact that significant numbers of African Americans served in World War II, fought, killed, died for this country, and those who came home were treated like dirt. That's a problem. That's a moral problem that became obvious to a lot of people. And some of the first institutions to integrate to end segregation, and this is not a coincidence, the military, that was the first major part of the government to desegregate. And Major League Baseball, as you probably know, Jackie Robinson, and then later other sports as well. What do the military and sports have to, what do they have in common? Here's the theory. Meritocracy, picking the best person for the job, is a virtue, but in the military and in sports, it is much more of a necessity than it might be in other places. If you pick your generals in the military context based on what they look like, that's really stupid, and you're going to lose the war, and you're going to get people killed. When you're picking a general, you need to pick the best person. And if you don't like what they look like, if you don't like their skin color, well, get over yourself, because this is life and death. You need to elevate people based on their talents and their ability and their character, not on what they look like. And if you insist on judging people by what they look like when you're coming up with your military strategy, you're going to get people killed and you're going to lose the war. Likewise with sports, merit matters. You want to win the game, you need to pick the best players, period. And if you say, I want to win the game, but I will only pick white players, okay, try that out in the NBA. Let me know how that works out for you. War in sports you can look at as just a much more peaceful form of war, right? They're competitions in which someone will lose. You need to pick the best person. And if you're racist, you need to get over it. And if you don't, you're going to lose. And so it's maybe not a moral awakening, but it's more of a practical reality that, hey, racism is not only evil, it's also stupid. It holds back progress. It shuts out talented people. That's not good for society. And we can see that clearly in the context of the military and professional sports. The early strategy, the NAACP lawyers sue the government to force them to protect the rights of African Americans. This goes all the way back to the first unit in the course. The early strategy here was very conservative. It was very limited. It's very direct. And what these lawyers were saying, and this NAACP lawyer in the center of this photograph here with the trench coat is Thurgood Marshall. He later became the first Black Supreme Court justice. What the strategy was, it was legal, right? We're going to go to court. We're going to use the system. We're not going to start a violent revolution. We're going to use the system. That's a conservative approach. And what are we going to try to convince the courts to do? Not to change radically the nature of the country. All we're going to do is go to court and say to the government, here's what we're asking you to do. And this is where we go back to Reconstruction. Remember the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment? Remember the Enforce Acts? Remember all this stuff about Black people must be allowed to vote or else the states will be punished, all that stuff during Reconstruction? Enforce the laws that have been on the books for the last 100 years. That's what they're saying. How do you argue against that? So it's a very smart strategy, right? We're not looking to turn the country on its head. We're not looking for some kind of revolution. We're using the system to say all we want is for the laws to be enforced. That's it. That's literally the government's job. That's why governments exist, if you believe Thomas Jefferson, to protect the rights of its people. That's it, period. Do your job. Very straightforward, conservative, focused argument. How do you argue against that in court if you're the government? No, we're not going to enforce the law. So very, very clever, very focused, hard to argue against. Uh, so Thurgood Marshall convinces the first major watershed case that you've probably heard of is Brown versus Board of Education. And this uh, said, this ruling was significant because it said segregation is unconstitutional. We covered briefly earlier in the course Plessy versus Ferguson. That was a Supreme Court case from 60 years before this that said segregation is constitutional. So this is another example of something we talked about earlier, which is our Supreme Court sets precedent, yes. And precedent usually means it's settled, and we're not going to argue this again, but sometimes a precedent is so bad that we need the flexibility to overturn it. The last major example of that in our timeline, of course, was the abortion issue. And obviously, there's no consensus on the abortion issue in this country. I'm sure you've noticed. But there is consensus that this, Brown versus Board of Education, is the perfect example of how sometimes precedent must be undone. So what's the significance? All segregation is unconstitutional. And the term that was used to cover it up, separate but equal, that was a lie. But then the question is, because as we covered during the Reconstruction Unit, the federal government can say whatever they want. They can pass any law they want. They can add an amendment to the Constitution. Those are just words. Will they enforce? Will they force states, especially in the South, to follow the ruling? Now, as we covered earlier during Reconstruction, the federal government kind of gave up on trying to enforce the 13th, 14th. Okay. No, they're going to resist. They're going to say, all right, make us. Those are words on a piece of paper. We don't care. So that's the question. Will they force the states to actually follow through in a way that wasn't done 100 years prior after the Civil War? The reaction of the white supremacist Democrat power structure in the South was very similar to what it was at the end of the Civil War. White Citizens Council, KKK, local police. We covered basically this exact same thing from, 100 years earlier. They're going to resist. The White Citizens Council is a civil society group made up of businessmen, restaurant owners, bankers, etc. So those businesses are going to group together and conspire to not integrate their businesses. And if any business does integrate, they're going to try to punish them by maybe refusing to give them loans to run their business or whatever else. So they're going to uh, use economic pressure to try to keep segregation in place. The Klan, that's the terrorist arm of this resistance, and the local police, who are very often colluding with the Klan or, again, this guy could pull off his hood and be the sheriff for all we know. So there was going to be resistance. Rosa Parks, you've all heard of her. First and most well-known example of nonviolent civil disobedience, direct action, kind of the Martin Luther King playbook. Montgomery bus boycott, you all know the story. The buses were segregated. She refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. She was arrested. The Black community in Montgomery, Alabama responds by refusing to ride the bus. That is a nonviolent direct action by civil society to try to force a change. They stuck with this boycott for the better part of a year. They organized amongst themselves on sharing automobiles, doing whatever it took to economically starve the bus company until the point that the bus company had to change their minds. Did the bus company have a moral awakening and realize we were evil? Probably not. It was probably more money talks, and they were going bankrupt. So they had to change their behavior accordingly. So boycotting, using money and or withholding money, same idea, to force change from private businesses. Great example of civil society engaging in nonviolent direct action to change, to fix a problem. This wasn't the government. The government didn't do anything. It's normal, everyday people making things happen. This is when Dr. King first emerges as a major leader of this movement and a new strategy, which again, nonviolent direct action, to draw attention to the issue using protest, using TV, willingly going to jail to raise awareness, etc. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, you've all heard that. Um, there's nothing, well, now it's looked at as, this iconic moment in American history, and everybody loves that speech and nobody disagrees with it. I know you've heard the centerpiece of that speech, dreaming of a colorblind society, basically, where people are judged, the language, by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. A colorblind meritocracy. Later on, we'll get to this in the next unit. Dr. King's rhetoric changed radically. And there are other speeches he gave later in his career that I'm quite sure you've never heard, and that you will never hear any politician quotes. But this is kind of his best known speech. And President Kennedy responded with the Civil Rights Address, one of the most remarkable speeches ever given by an American president. I have that uploaded onto Canvas if you want to take a look at that. And the significance of Kennedy's Civil Rights Address was he made it clear that unlike 100 years earlier, the federal government was going to enforce federal law in states that resisted. And President Kennedy, to his credit, started sending federal law enforcement and or the military into the southern states to force them, sometimes at the point of a gun, to integrate the schools. And if he didn't do that, Brown versus Board of Education is just words on a piece of paper. But Kennedy, unlike the presidents during Reconstruction 100 years earlier, had the moral courage to enforce the law. It's important to understand that by doing so, President Kennedy was putting his reelection at serious risk. He was a Democrat. The entire South was Democrat. No Democrat could be elected president without winning the southern states. Okay? And for President Kennedy, and we covered this earlier, remember that the two main pillars of the Democrat Party for 100 years were the white supremacists in the South and the major cities in the North with mostly immigrants. And Kennedy was part of that wing. He was from Boston. He was the grandson of Irish immigrants. You probably know that. Well, the other wing was the white supremacist South. When Kennedy came out and gave that speech and made it clear that he would use force if necessary to integrate the schools and protect the rights of African Americans, morally, that's the right thing to do. Politically, he was putting himself in a position where he could very well have lost re-election because the southern states were furious at him. Now, as you know, he wasn't reelected because he was murdered. And one of the many conspiracy theories, they're endless, there's hundreds of them. But 5 months after Kennedy gave this speech, the Civil Rights Address, he got his head blown off. Where? In Texas, which is part of the old Confederacy. Do you see how many people concluded that Kennedy was killed because of this speech? Now, that's not true, but makes sense on paper, right? So he took a major risk by doing the right thing. The Soviet Union, the book points this out, the Soviet Union used American racism as a means of discrediting the United States abroad. Yeah, there was a Cold War component to this. It's a moral issue within our own country, to be sure, but also in the context of the Cold War, where we're saying in our propaganda, we're a democracy. Well, if yeah, for white people, right? Remember all of the covered this briefly in the last unit, I think. All of the countries in Africa, for example, were getting independence during this period. And the Soviet Union and the United States want these newly independent African countries to side with them in the context of the Cold War. How is our government going to convince the governments of the newly independent nation of Nigeria that they should be allies with the United States when the Nigerian government, let's say the president of Nigeria, knows very well that if he goes to Washington, D.C. and meets with President Kennedy and then leaves the White House and goes down the street to try to get a cheeseburger, he's going to be treated like a piece of dirt, even though he's the president of Nigeria. He would be told to go sit in the back. How's that going to work? So there was a moral component in our country, of course, but also the way other countries are looking at us. This is a problem. And the Soviet Union was very good at using that reality to make us look bad. Wasn't hard to do. Quote from the book, I want you to think critically about Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans endured a caste system not unlike the Jim Crow system in the South. So Jim Crow, you know what that is. That's a segregation going on in the South, the de facto or de jure segregation rather. Okay. What this quote from the book is saying, well, they're comparing clearly the treatment of Mexican Americans to the treatment of African Americans. That's what they're doing, right? Pretty clearly. Mexican Americans' experience was not unlike that of Black folks in the South and the Jim Crow. Okay. I want you to think critically about this. There is a phrase now, it's an acronym that's in widespread use over the last 5 years or so, BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And it's this new construct that a lot of people use. And the theory behind that idea, and you can see it in this quote here from the textbook, the theory goes like this, and let me know if this makes sense to you. Black, Indigenous, People of Color, BIPOC. The idea behind that in the quote right here that we're looking at, the thesis is any non-white American has a similar experience of discrimination. Right, that's what they're doing in this quote. Mexican Americans' experience was not unlike the experience of African Americans. Okay. Ask yourself if that makes sense to you. Do all non-white Americans have a similar experience of discrimination and prejudice? Maybe. Here's the counterclaim to this quote. Well, first of all, I would point out, look at per person income levels in this country by ethnicity. And, you know, you might be surprised. Okay. The highest earners in this country, and it's not close, are non-white. Right. The top 5 or 6 highest income groups in this country are all from Asia. So that might put a little doubt to that. But here's what I want you to think about specific to this quote. They're comparing the experience of Mexican Americans with African Americans. Okay. Maybe that fits. Here's the counterclaim. Ready? There is one group of people in the history of this country that were enslaved, brought here against their will, and enslaved. One group, not 2, not 7, 1. And you know exactly who those people were. And from a certain point of view, it is a gross insult to African Americans to in any way imply that any other group of people in this country have been treated the way that Black Americans have been treated. It's a disgusting insult. So try that on for size. Mexican Americans were never enslaved. They were not kidnapped in Mexico and forced to come to America against their will. Jewish Americans, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, women, you name the group. There's one group in the history of this country who have been enslaved, not two, not 10. So lumping in all these experiences, all non-white people have had, maybe, or maybe be very careful about conflating things. The danger in that, the danger in conflating these things is that you run the risk of diluting, watering down the true horror, the unique horror of slavery. Comparing slavery to, being a Mexican immigrant to a lot of people is completely downplaying the horror of slavery. In a similar vein, let me give you a kind of another example of this. Be very careful about comparing things to slavery. Likewise, be very careful about comparing things to the Holocaust. You see what I'm saying? When you see something bad happen, be very careful about like, oh, this is just like the Holocaust. Some things are so uniquely bad that we need to be very careful about conflating them with other things. So think about those two points of view and which makes the most sense to you. Civil Rights Act in 1964, this is a great example of a law that shouldn't have been necessary, but unfortunately it was. And it basically said, all right, 100 years later, this time we're super duper serious. This time we're actually going to have a Civil Rights Act that we enforce. And we did. It was enforced, unlike those laws during Reconstruction. So here's Dr. King with President Johnson, who signed the Civil Rights Act. This is after the assassination of President Kennedy. And the Civil Rights Act was basically something that Kennedy was proposing in that speech I referenced earlier, and then he was killed. And this law was ultimately passed, in large part due to sympathy for the murdered president. So in that way, you could say that Kennedy gave his life for civil rights, because if it weren't for sympathy after his murder, this very well may not have passed. The dominant paradigm of this Civil Rights Act is who's the hero? In most of the textbooks, the government, and specifically the Democrats. Um, this law passed the Senate, obviously, and approximately 80% of the senators who voted against it were Democrats. The Civil Rights Act passed because of Republicans. Almost all the no votes were Democrats, but they get credit in the textbook for making it happen. Okay. President Johnson was a Democrat. To his credit, he signed this law. And then after the room emptied out, he turned and said to his aides, and this is in many books, including books written by supporters of President Johnson. He signed this law, and then the room emptied out, and he turned to his aides and he said, I'll have these N-words voting Democrat for the next 100 years. So there's that. Voting Rights Act, again, shouldn't have been necessary, but it basically said, the federal government will enforce the 15th Amendment in the southern states and will make sure that citizens are allowed to vote. Legal equality is now guaranteed. Now, here's the thing with these movements. This is a major, major victory. Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, legal equality, equality on paper, equality under the law, is guaranteed, has been for 60 years. It is illegal to treat American citizens differently based on the color of their skin. It's illegal. Does that mean it doesn't happen? No, you know that. You can make things illegal, but that doesn't change people's hearts and minds. All right, so this is a huge victory, but did it undo all of the injustice? Did it magically erase all of the inequality? No, no, that's an infinitely more complex thing to do. So after the laws were changed, which to be sure, again, monumental victory, but it's not going to magically just, bring order to the universe overnight. Life is not like that. So then the question becomes, all right, we've had these huge victories. Segregation, dead. Wow. Fantastic victory. Civil Rights Act in effect, Voting Rights Act. Now we're at a point where African Americans can vote without being harassed. Huge, huge monumental victories. But again, it doesn't somehow undo all the inequality and all the injustice from the past. So then the movement starts to fragment, to splinter. Because before there was agreement. All right, what do we need to do? We need to end segregation. Boom. We need to get the right to vote. Boom, boom. All right. After that's done, then it's much less clear what do we do next? And so the movement starts to shift. Your textbook points out over the next generation, so the next 20 years or so after the Civil Rights Act, Southern whites and many conservative Northern whites would respond by switching to the Republican Party. Would respond to what? Uh, the fact that the Civil Rights Acts were passed. So here's what they're saying. Southern whites were angry about the civil rights movements. And to be sure, many of them were. There was lots of resistance. Southern whites were angry that the Democrats, kind of, sort of, passed the civil rights laws. They were angry about the civil rights movement. Okay. And they all voted for Democrats since before the Civil War. So the book is saying now they would respond by switching to the Republican Party. And for the first time, Southern states started voting for Republicans. And that continues to this day. That would have been unthinkable, right? Because Lincoln was a Republican. That would have been unthinkable before. But slowly, the Southern states started voting not for Democrats, but for Republicans. And the conventional wisdom is that's because all the racists in the South switched to the Republican Party. Therefore, the Republican Party became the party of racism. Very common narrative. And as evidence, they show you this map, 1972. Richard Nixon is in blue. He was a Republican. Look, he won all the Southern states. That would have been unheard of 20 years earlier. Yeah. So the Southern states, motivated by racism, voted for the Republicans in 1972. You know who else voted for the Republicans in 1972? The entire country. The Republican candidate won 49 states in 1972. So maybe there's something else going on. Look at presidential election maps from 1992, 1996. Bill Clinton, Democrat, won many, many southern states. Look at 2008. Barack Obama, Democrat. Also, you may have noticed, black man won several former Confederate states in 2008. There's something else going on here. Why are people leaving the Democrat Party during this period? Some of it is because Southern whites were motivated by racism. They were angry at the Democrats, to be sure. In the next unit, we'll see there was other stuff going on. The Vietnam War, run by the Democrats, didn't go very well. A lot of people were angry about that. The fact that during the 1960s, when the Democrats were in charge of the federal government, the murder rate doubled. There are other reasons why people change the way they vote. I also want you to, I want to point out to you here, Southern whites, that's shorthand for racist, and many conservative Northern whites. Do you notice the conflation of conservatism with racism? Not very subtle. After 1965, the movement splits. Differing goals. What do we do? Tactics. How do we do it? Quote from the book. As crucial as legal equality was, how much did it matter if most people of color, there's that construct again, people of color, remained in or close to poverty, if white society still regarded non-whites as inferior? So this is kind of what I was talking about. You can change the law. You can make sure you have legal equality on paper, but you can't change people's hearts and minds. That's what the text is kind of saying here. Couple things about this quote. Again, that people of color construct, not African Americans, but people of color, okay? Most people of color remained in or close to poverty. False, not true, objectively not true. Most people of color were in poverty or close. No, no. You could say disproportionate numbers of people in poverty were people of color, but most people of color were not in poverty. Okay. If white society still regarded non-whites as inferior, how true is that? I don't know. I wish it wasn't true at all. Obviously, there's some truth to it, but what they're saying is you can change the law, you can't change people's minds or their hearts. That's a generational process, right? Um, so first example of the movement kind of splitting along different tracks about what to do next and how to do it. Malcolm X, for most of his public life, was a member of the Nation of Islam, if you've ever heard of them. Unlike Dr. King, Malcolm X advocated for self-segregation. So he's not pushing for integration. He's pushing for, he wants segregation, and he wants it not to be something forced on Black people, but something that Black people choose for themselves, self-segregation. So here was Malcolm X, and many, many others agreed with him, but here was his critique of Dr. King. Goes like this. Malcolm X basically said about Dr. King, you are pathetic. You are weak. You are begging people who hate you. You are begging them to be included in their society. You're begging for integration. You're begging white people to let you join, in their groups. Let me come to your school. Let me do this and that. They don't want you. This is Malcolm X's critique of Dr. King. And it is pathetic and degrading and emasculating to beg for a seat at a table with people who clearly hate you. It's pathetic. And instead, we should have our own table. We should do our own thing. We should have our own businesses, our own banks, our own schools, and have nothing to do with white people because they clearly want nothing to do with us. That's his critique, okay? Some quotes from him. The greatest threat to the Black man is the white liberal. Obviously, Dr. King would not agree with that. Dr. King would look at white liberals as allies to the civil rights movement. And look at any civil rights era march, protest, you're going to see large numbers of white people. And Dr. King was very intentional about that. We need to build bridges between the white and Black community. Malcolm X didn't trust white liberals. Dr. King did. Malcolm X thought that white liberals did not have pure intentions, that they were self-centered, that they made everything about themselves, and if they latched onto the civil rights movement, the white liberals, it was really because they, the white liberals, wanted to make it all about them and wanted to virtue signal. Look what a good person I am. I'm marching with Dr. King. He didn't trust those people. He didn't trust that they had the best interest of the Black community at heart. Stop talking about the South. As long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're in the South. He's talking about de facto segregation. Stop pretending segregation is only a problem in Mississippi. Malcolm X spent much of his early adulthood in Boston and New York. He understood very well Boston and New York, Roxbury, Harlem. Those were segregated places as well. Nonviolence is fine as long as it works. So he is not on board with the nonviolence as practiced by Dr. King, which is you get beat up and you take it. You do not even defend yourself. Malcolm X, he's not into that. So he's not advocating for violence, but he's saying we do believe in self-defense. All right, if someone puts their hands on you, you know, cut their hand off. You don't let them hurt you. So obvious differing viewpoints. from Dr. King. Malcolm X was much more popular among younger, more urban-based uh, African Americans in places like New York, Chicago, whereas Dr. King's vision was much more popular among older, slightly older, generally more conservative Southern Baptist, traditionalist blacks in the South. So it's kind of a generational split and a geographical split there, right? You go to Georgia, right? You're going to find supporters mostly of Dr. King. You go to New York City, you're going to find supporters of Malcolm X. He was assassinated in the mid 60s by members of his former group, the Nation of Islam, for convoluted reasons. Basically, he left the group that he had been with for his whole career, and they were felt betrayed by that, and they killed him. One of many, many high-profile assassinations during this period. The final 2 years of his life, Dr. King's rhetoric changed, and he became much more radical. He was mostly focused on opposition to the Vietnam War and advocating for massive redistribution of wealth. He started talking a lot more about issues that to him were connected with the civil rights struggle. But to other people seemed like, well, you're losing focus here. We're talking about voting rights. We're talking about the Civil Rights Act. What does the Vietnam War have to do with that? And Dr. King sees all of these issues as part of the civil rights movement. Massive redistribution of wealth. Look, economically, King was essentially a socialist. He was, okay? That's just part of his worldview. So he, on the economic front, was advocating for essentially a massive reparations program after the fact, right? The massive redistribution of wealth. Um, and in the final months of his life, he was planning a massive, what was to be called the Poor People's March on Washington. So the original March on Washington, that's where he gave that I Have a Dream speech. Okay. So he's planning another March on Washington. What's the problem? The I Have a Dream speech, that March on Washington, it was one day. All right. People showed up, hundreds of thousands of people from all over the country. They show up, listen to a bunch of speeches and musical artists, etc. The I Have a Dream speech was the most iconic moment of the day, of course. And by the time the sun goes down, everyone's leaving, picking up their litter. They left the place spotless, got on their buses, went home. So that's not a threat from the government's point of view. Bunch of people come here, listen to speeches, go home. Fine. This march on Washington that he was planning was much different. He was planning for huge numbers, hundreds of thousands minimum, of poor people of all races to come to Washington and not hang out for a day and listen to some speeches and go home, but to indefinitely stay there. Hundreds of thousands of poor people setting up tents outside the White House, outside the Congress, and staying there indefinitely until they got certain demands met. Do you see how for the government that's a much bigger threat? Does our government want hundreds of thousands of poor people in tents sleeping right outside the White House? How's that going to look to the rest of the world? And ultimately, those people can't stay there forever. How are we going to remove them? Are we going to send in police on horses? Like, this is not something the government wanted to deal with at all, right? So from the government's point of view, Dr. King is getting much more radical, much more dangerous with his rhetoric and his plans. And this is the point at which he is assassinated. There's no film of this assassination. This is the most iconic photograph taken very shortly after the fact. You can see him laying on the ground there with his leg kind of bent up on the railing. So he's at this hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, comes out to the balcony smoking a cigarette, and someone across the street, 30-06 right in the jaw, just right through his spine, just killed him instantly. And his friends rushed out, and this is, they're pointing to where they think the the shot came from. The degree to which the federal government was monitoring, following, surveilling, spying on Dr. King is not to be underestimated. Okay. And there are many, many people who think that our government had some role in his murder. And for what it's worth, I tend to think that they might be right. Uh, Another alternative view to Dr. King, kind of a similar vein of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, is the Black Panther Party. So in the sense of self-segregation, just like what Malcolm X was saying, Malcolm X had a great quote, said, "The only thing I like integrated is my coffee." So they want self-separation. And this is another younger, kind of more leftist, urban-centered group. So the Black Panther Party started in Oakland and then spread to Chicago and other major cities. They set up their own nursery schools and food distribution centers in their neighborhoods. They were big into the Second Amendment. Know the rules, know the law, get guns. Carry them in public where allowed. Make sure everyone knows that we are armed and we're not going to shoot you, but if you shoot us, that's the last decision you're ever going to make. We are armed. We are ready to defend ourselves. That's a big part of their rhetoric. And they're for self-segregation, setting up their own institutions, schools, businesses, banks, whatever it may be. These groups, Black Panther Party, anyone associated with Martin Luther King, anti-war groups, any number of groups were subjected to what we'll end with here, the FBI's COINTELPRO program. So this is the FBI using warrantless surveillance, paid informants, agent provocateurs, and disinformation to undermine civil rights groups. I want to show you a document on COINTELPRO. I put this on our Canvas page. So there's a couple layers of this that I want you to think about. We'll go through what this was. It's a gross violation of the constitutional rights of American citizens, to be sure. The question I want you to think about as we go through this is, are you comfortable with our government doing this kind of stuff to anybody for any reason? And I also want you to understand that our government still does this. So let's walk through this first, and then we'll kind of tie in those last two things. Key Black activists were repeatedly arrested on any excuse until they can no longer make bail. The FBI made use of informants, often quite violently and emotionally disturbed individuals, to prevent false testimony to courts, to frame targets for crimes they knew they did not commit. In some cases, the charges were quite serious, including murder. The FBI solicited perjury, false testimony, to frame American citizens for crimes they, the FBI, knew they did not commit. That's a problem. Another option is snitch jacketing, making a target look like a snitch, look like a police informant or a CIA agent. Here's how this will work. Let's say the FBI is targeting the Black Panther Party. The FBI would, let's say, send an anonymous letter to the leader of the Black Panther Party saying, your number two, your right-hand man, he's a snitch. So here's how it would start. The FBI, in this example, the FBI would approach the number two guy in the Black Panther Party and say, you are going to snitch on your group for us, the FBI. And one of two things will happen. If the number two guy in this example says, all right, you pay me and I'll feed you information. Good. Now the FBI is getting information on this group. If more likely the guy says, are you serious? I'm not snitching on you. I'm not snitching for you, rather. I'm not snitching on my group. The FBI would say, all right, fine, don't snitch. We're going to tell them that you're a snitch, even though you're not. And so either way, they're going to, you're toast. You're either going to snitch or we're going to falsely accuse you of being a snitch. Pick one. All right, that's what snitch jacketing is about. And it's to increase fear and paranoia within the group. Black bag jobs are burglaries performed in order to obtain written material, mailing lists, 10,000 homes were subjected to illegal breaking and entering by the FBI. Now they wouldn't need to do this. They would just do it virtually, digitally, right? They just hack into your computer or your phone and suck up your contact list and your text messages or whatever else. Back then they had to do it physically because everything was on paper. The FBI broke into, without warrants, right? This is just burglary, broke into at least 10,000 American homes, went through the papers, took photographs of whatever information they wanted, put everything back so no one knew they were there, and left. Fourth Amendment? Huh? What's that? Um, Anonymous mailings, so just, anonymous letters and stuff to try to create paranoia and disinformation within the group. FBI agents use media contacts and other sources available to government to, you know, push false information, to ridicule and discredit them. The FBI using our media to push lies. Wow. That would never happen now, right? That's crazy. Hopefully you're detecting a bit of my sarcasm there. Perhaps you're old enough to remember the time that the FBI used our news media to push the ridiculous fabrication that President Trump stole the 2016 election by virtue of something with the Russian government or something. They still do stuff like this, all right? Many counterintelligence agents are they're using paid informants. Informants became agent provocateurs by raising controversial issues at meetings or by inciting the group to violent acts, even to the point of providing them with weapons. Here's how this works. The FBI sends someone into a meeting of the Black Panther Party, let's say. And that FBI informant goes to the meetings for a couple months. People get to recognize the person. Okay. And after one meeting, for example, the FBI informant would raise his hand and say, hey, look, I'm sick of talking. Let's blow up a police station. Come on. Let's get serious. Let's blow up a police station. Inciting the group to violent acts, even to the point of providing them with weapons. So if in this example, the guy is like, hey, let's blow up a police station. And if people are like, hey, that's crazy. Come on, man, relax. But we don't even have any explosives. Like you sound like a crazy person. Well, then the FBI informant could say, oh, I know, I can get you explosives. And at that point, they could say, aha, we, the FBI, prevented this terrorist attack. These people were going to blow up a police station. Were they? Or did you send someone in there to propose that and then act like the group came up with the idea and then you arrest them all, right? That's what that's about. One last example having to do with Dr. King. 1964, he was going to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. 2 days after the announcement that he was getting this award, the FBI agent, COINTELPRO specialist William Sullivan King caused a composite audio tape to be produced consisting of highlights taken from taps of King's phones and bugs placed in his various hotel rooms. So the FBI put together a tape based on illegal spying on Dr. King. What was on the tape? Well, Dr. King was a great man, but he was a man, meaning he was flawed. And apparently his major weakness was he wasn't great at the whole monogamy thing. And the FBI, by virtue of following him and spying on him for years, had recordings of him doing things that he shouldn't have been doing with women not his wife, shall we say. And they wrote Dr. King a letter, the FBI did, saying that unless he, Dr. King, committed suicide prior to getting the Nobel Prize, they, the FBI, would release this tape and destroy his reputation. And he called their bluff, of course, and didn't commit suicide, and they didn't release the tape, presumably because then they would have to somehow explain how they got it. So pretty underhanded stuff. And our FBI, our government, our law enforcement agencies still engage in these types of tactics. So are you comfortable with our government doing this to anybody, to any group? Some of the tactics I talked about here, violating First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, and pick one. You comfortable with this? If you say no, let me make this even more complex by pointing out that during this period, one of the groups targeted and pretty much destroyed by COINTELPRO, by the FBI, using these illegal tactics, was the KKK. Are you good with that? Because everyone hates the Klan, right? So are you, is that okay with you that the FBI violated the constitutional rights of the Klan? Who cares, right? They're the Klan. We hate the Klan. Yes. But you see how complex this is? If you let the government do that to the Klan, the nature of power, they can say, we'll only use this against the bad guys. And then you turn around 5 minutes later and they're using it against Dr. King and anti-war protesters and anyone else who looks at him sideways. It's a slippery slope, right? So that wraps up this unit, and I will see you next time.